Now, the first question that comes up with the supply chain: do the members of the supply chain compete with each other, or do they cooperate? In other words, is the goal to maximize the profit of the entire supply chain, or to maximize the profit of the individual? Now, this can get interesting. This can get tricky. After all, the relationship in a supply chain is generally determined by contract. You have a supplier and a retailer that make agreements. Agreements on things like price, like quality. And enforcing those agreements, well, let's just say that there's a reason why lawyers make the money they do. So, you need to have some sort of mechanism within the supply chain to encourage cooperation. So there's things like vendor managed inventory, where it's the supplier that makes a decision as to how much is on the shelves. You have things like revenue sharing, where the supplier takes some of the risk that comes with stocking this good in retail. That said, the manufacturer has a different view on this order. They have their own costs when it comes to this particular order. Every time that Drugs Online orders, they have to have this cost to fill it. Now, each bottle of vitamins costs a certain amount to make, which is different from the price that Drugs Online pays. And the holding costs are different as well as a result. So you have a different EOQ from the perspective of the manufacturer. As a result, there's some disagreement here as to how much should be ordered, as to how much Drugs Online would want to order, as to how much the manufacturer would want Drugs Online to order. Can we do better? Well, yes. What you can do is you can find an EOQ for the entire supply chain. You can find the holding cost for the entire supply chain. You can find the ordering cost per item for the entire supply chain. After all, both sides have some costs here. And of course, you have demand. So you can calculate an EOQ for your entire supply chain. Let's take another problem. This one we're going to do and work through for the simple reason that the effects are fascinating. At any rate, consider Tech Fiber. They make high-end ski jackets. They sell these jackets only through ski adventure stores. Each jacket costs them $10 to make, and they sell the jackets to Ski Adventure for the wholesale price of $100 each. Now, Ski Adventure then sells each jacket for $200, its retail price. Now, customer demand for the jackets is estimated to be normally distributed with a mean of 1,000 and a standard deviation of 30. If Ski Adventure does not sell a jacket at the end of the season, they are disposed of for no value. So here's the question. First, what is Tech Fiber's optimal policy? Second, what's Ski Adventure's optimal policy? And third, what is the optimal policy for the entire supply chain? So let's do this. Let's take a look at all of this from Tech Fiber's perspective. So, cumulative probability distribution, normal curve, mean of 1,000, standard deviation of 30. Cost of overage. Cost of overage, well, Tech Fiber makes the coats for $10. There is no salvage value. So, cost of overage is 10. How about the cost of shortage? Well, they make the coats for 10, sell them for 100. So the cost of shortage is 100 minus 10 equal to 90. This gives us all the stuff we need to find the critical ratio. Well, critical ratio is just going to be cost of shortage divided by cost of shortage plus cost of overage. So 90 divided by 90 plus 10 is equal to 0.9. So what we want is a 90% probability of not running out. Well, when we convert that 0.9000 to a z-value, we get a z-value of 1.28. We then use this to find our optimal order amount, so Q equals mean plus z value times standard deviation. So 1,000 plus 1.28 times 30. This equals about 1,038.4. So if you want to round up, you want to round down, either one will do, but basically 1,038 or 1,039 coats. So, second one. What about from Ski Adventure's perspective? Well, normal distribution is still the same. Cost of overage is different though. Here, Ski Adventure buys the coats for $100. There is no salvage value. So, cost of overage is equal to $100. So then there's the cost of shortage. The cost of shortage, well, they buy the coats for $100 and then sell them for $200. So the cost of shortage is $200 minus $100 is equal to $100. When we calculate the critical ratio, well, we find that the critical ratio is 0.500, 1 half. So we want a 50% probability of not running out. Well, as it happens, that gives us a z-value of 0. So if we have a z-value of 0, we order exactly the mean. We order exactly the average. So our optimal order amount from Ski Adventure's perspective is exactly 1,000 coats. Now you'll note this is a lot less than Tech Fiber. And there are reasons for that. We'll discuss those in just a second. How about from the entire supply chain's perspective? In other words, what order amount would maximize the profit, the expected profit, for the entire supply chain? Well, what we do is we treat the supply chain as one entity, one box. So, again, probability distribution hasn't changed. Cost of overage. What does it cost the supply chain to get a coat? Well, the supply chain makes a coat for $10. There is no salvage value. So, cost of overage is $10. Now the cost of shortage, well, supply chain makes the coats for $10, sells them for $200. So the cost of shortage is going to be 200 minus 10 is equal to 190. So when we calculate the critical ratio, well, we have a critical ratio of 0.95, 95%. So when we look up the z-value for this, z-value is about 1.645. This gives us an optimal order amount. In other words, the order amount that maximizes the profit for the entire supply chain as 1,049.4 coats. And again, you could round up, you could round down, either way. These were some really interesting results. I mean, you had the optimal order amount for the supply chain that was higher than what either Tech Fiber or Ski Adventures wanted. This is actually fairly normal. This is what's known as double marginalization. In other words, whatever is best for the supply chain is actually a higher order amount than what either Tech Fiber or Ski Adventure wanted. So, in this case, you have the margin for the supply chain. You have $90 going to Tech Fiber and $100 going to Ski Adventure. And again, the supply chain gets these coats for $10. Now, because Tech Fiber and Ski Adventures make their decisions individually without considering what the other one wants, they aren't maximizing the optimal order amount for the entire supply chain. They're only considering their own margin rather than the amount of money that the entire supply chain could make. So, how do we fix this? Well, how we fix this is we find some method to distribute risk and distribute reward across the entire supply chain. One easy method is what's known as a buyback contract. Bookstores, you see this fairly often. Magazines will generally buy back what doesn't sell. So, the manufacturer agrees to buy back any items which the retailer doesn't sell at the end of the season. So in this case, the manufacturer will sell the magazines for a certain amount, and then will buy back any unsold magazines for another amount. So, a good way of thinking about this, instead of having this clearance price whatever it may be, this buyback contract substitutes for that clearance price. So the cost of overage would just be, for the retailer, would just be the retail price minus the buyback contract. Another tool that's available is what's known as revenue sharing. The idea here is that instead of selling at a fairly larger price, the wholesaler sells to the retailer at a much smaller price. However, if the retailer sells this item at retail, the retailer has to give a portion of their earnings, a portion of their revenue, back to the supplier. So, if Tech Fiber decides, a way to think about it, suppose Tech Fiber decided, instead of selling the coats of Ski Adventure for $100, we'll sell it to them for only $50. However, for each one that Ski Adventure sells, Ski Adventure has to give us $50 back. That's revenue sharing. What's going on here is the retailer has to pay $50 for the coat, and that's guaranteed no matter what. But the retailer only has to pay the other $50 if the coat sells. So, some revenue sharing there. So what do these have in common? What do buyback contracts have in common? What do revenue sharing schemes have in common? They distribute risk across the supply chain. You recall, as you go further along in the supply chain, inventory becomes more expensive. After all, an iPad is a lot more expensive than dirt in general. So, because of this, the retailer holds most of the risk in the supply chain. So what goes on with a buyback contract, what goes on with revenue sharing is, it's sort of a message from a supplier to the retailer. They're saying, we understand what you're doing, we want to sell more, and to help you sell more, we will take on some of the risk that comes with holding this inventory. Now, there are other reasons to have a buyback contract system other than simply to redistribute risk across the supply chain. First, you have the redistribution of inventory across the supply chain. In other words, you have incentive for the retailer to hold more inventory. So you have that. Second, it protects the brand image. Apple is really good with buyback contracts, and there's a reason why. It does not like seeing its product on sale. So, rather than have the product on sale, Apple will buy back its own product and then sell it as a refurbished item, rather than watch it go significantly on sale, go on clearance, if you will. Third, one other thing about a buyback contract is that it can be a signal to the retailer that, hey, we're about to have a major marketing push. We want you to stock more items. So, to that end, here's a buyback contract to help you out with that. So there are other uses for buyback contracts besides simply redistributing the risk across the entire supply chain. Now, there are some other issues that come up, other ways to have collaboration with regard to a supply chain. You could have quantity flexibility. Here, the retailer commits to a range of order amounts. That way, there is some cooperation there. You can have vendor managed inventory. In this case, it's the supplier who decides how much is put on the shelf. You can have consignment. And the way consignment works is a supplier, for lack of a better way of putting it, rents shelf space. So the supplier puts their good on the shelf of this retailer. The item is eventually rung up. The retailer then gives the money back to the supplier. However, again, the retailer, in a sense, never owned the item. They held on to it, but they never owned the item. And then there's pricing collaboration, which, yeah, there's some legal issues involved with that. Ultimately, you have conflict within the supply chain, in some ways, self-conflict within the supply chain, because there will always be this tendency, this desire within a company to maximize its profits. So, within the relationships within the supply chain, within the contracts that define the supply chain, there must always be some method of incentive and or punishment to make sure that firms act with the best interest of the supply chain rather than the best interest of each individual company. Because if the goal is to increase the total profit of the entire supply chain, the result of that is going to be different than the results of each actor within the supply chain acting separately. As such, you need to word the contract such that each actor within the supply chain has incentive to act toward the optimality of the entire supply chain.